I'm Frank Garza, and welcome to Here and Abroad, a podcast that follows the U.S. men's national team and their player pool across Europe, MLS, or wherever else they play their club football. On today's show, we are going to preview the USMNT's upcoming friendlies against Uzbekistan this Saturday, September 9th, and then against Oman the following Tuesday, September 12th. To help me preview these matches, I've invited Mike Woitala to join the show. Mike is the executive editor of Soccer America. Mike, welcome to the show.
That's my pleasure. Nice to be here. Thank you.
So, Mike, we have these two friendlies coming up, and these friendlies also, they mark the beginning of Gregg Berhalter 2.0, as it's his first time being back on the sidelines since the U.S. lost to the Netherlands back at the World Cup. And so I want to start our conversation there. Is there anything about Gregg Berhalter 2.0 that you're really curious to see, maybe how he'll approach certain things or changes he might make? What are some of the things you're looking for there?
Yeah, I actually asked him this question when he was rehired as coach, which he had been talking about how he had taken a very young team through qualifying and to the World Cup, which is true. It is remarkable how young that team was. And my question was, how are you going to keep, what's your coaching approach going to be now that these aren't young guys? They're not, in their late teen. The core group has now gone through, significant experience. His answer was that he didn't plan on changing his approach. Now, I know Gregg Berhalter is an intelligent person, and intelligent, smart coaches, I think, do adjust their approaches, and I imagine he would. But I do think that is an issue, is, he's going to have to guide players that aren't going to, be quite as malleable as they would be when, they were grateful that he was the one that brought him into the team and, into a World Cup.
Do you think he'll be, one of the things I wonder about is how much he's going to be willing to experiment, with different things. You saw his two assistants, Anthony Hudson and BJ Callahan, experiment with several, formations and different players they brought in. And I wonder, do you think he'll be that experimentative?
That's a big question. It was a big question when he became coach, because he was, Gregg in some ways is more on the science side than the art side when it comes to coaching. And part of that Dutch school, not the Cruyff Dutch school, but the Dutch school of a very sort of structured approach. And, I found that worrisome because I think in some ways that's a predictable approach. The over-reliance on outside backs to attack, not really having a traditional creative playmaker. The closest I think we might have to that is Gio Reyna. And I think we saw at the Nations League games, the game and a half that he played there, that he's the kind of player who can do the unpredictable and the creative. So to answer your question, I think he has to. I don't see how you cannot really reassess the way the team played as far as a style. I've also been kind of concerned of all this talk about their style and how they describe it. And I think my biggest worry is this, model that every player has to do everything and be all around and, track back and run. I'm not sure that's, what's going to produce the best style of soccer.
Well, what are some things you'd like to see him change or experiment with?
Well, the big question is, how do you balance the Latin style of play that so many of our players and much of our soccer community has, which is the world's most successful, Latin American countries, Southern European countries generally supply the best players and win the most over the long run. And then the traditional sort of American, I think we can say / Dutch, approach. Sometimes you'll see a game where you'll have a player out there like a Luca Della Torre and then your midfielders that look more like your typical American college midfielder. Now, when I say that, it's not the way it used to be. The level of skill and game intelligence is much higher than it was in the past, but this sort of hustle type approach, I think, is still, kind of plaguing our game some. And I would like to see a team play with more rhythm, and instead of being obsessed with attacking as soon as you get the ball, getting it back as soon as you lose it, and, center forward being judged by how much he harasses defenders. I think that's not the best way for us to go forward. I think we have to have a more Latin type of approach, a more unpredictability. I think it's okay if not every player defends like crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that because, Gregg has always said his vision is he wants to change the way the world views American soccer. But I think the world has viewed American soccer in terms of more of this like hustle approach that you're kind of like talking about there. So do you think he hasn't like backed up his vision with actions? Do you think he's still holding on to that old version despite what he says?
I think it's a more sophisticated version of traditional American soccer. And of course, the United States is unique in that we don't really have a style that you can point to. I thought it was remarkable to watch the Women's World Cup and see a Portuguese team that from a country where the women were only supported in soccer about 7 years ago, and they played with all the best attributes of the Portuguese style of play. It's so ingrained in their culture. Whereas we've gone over the years, with different approaches, we've had some, off and on some pretty attractive national team play, if you pick and choose through the era. But I think as far as, to get back to your question, I don't think he's failed as far as changing the view, because I do think that individual talent is higher than ever, but I think the jury's still out. I was not as impressed with the World Cup performance as a lot of people, probably because I'm old enough to remember that was not a major feat historically, to tie England to the World Cup or to get to the round of 16. The fact that it was such a young team, I do think is remarkable, but that's probably the first World Cup in a long time where we didn't have a single Latino starter, in the group play, I believe. And when I talk about with Latin style of soccer, I'm not just talking about Latinos themselves, but I'm talking about the Clint Dempsey who spent so much of his teenage years playing adult Latin soccer, and the Landon Donovan who grew up in a very Latin soccer environment when he first started, and that kind of unpredictability and skill. And I think that the team is still missing that. There's players on the roster with that potential. We're looking forward to seeing how Ben Cremaschi fares. I'm glad they're giving him a look. But you look at the roster and you still see a lot of guys who can fly up and down the wings, which I realize is a big part of soccer. But I think we saw how very predictable that can be.
Okay, so looking at these, two matches, these two friendlies coming up themselves, I mean, on Saturday, when you're kind of sitting down to watch the game and you see the lineups come out and you see the players take the field and the match get underway, what are some of the things you're going to be looking for? Some of the storylines you're going to be watching, players you're going to be watching?
With Christian Pulisic on the field, you're always going to watch that. The U.S. performance against Mexico in the Nations League, what I got to see in the stadium in Las Vegas, the 3-0 win over Mexico, the U.S. played remarkably well in that game. I think Pulisic had one of the best games the national team players ever had. And Gio Reyna was very important in that game as well, who's not here. So it'd be interesting to see what he plays like, where he sees himself. Because I used to be a little worried about what his role was going to be. You got a guy like that who's a big star in Europe. Does he come back and say, I need to do everything? But they seem to be finding his way. And then how some of the newcomers complement the core players. And then, as always, because I think it's important in soccer, is whether I enjoy watching it. I mean, I think that's very important in soccer, and especially like you and I who watch soccer all the time, we like to, it's not fun watching bad soccer. So I want to be entertained. And certainly there's some players on this field on this roster that, could do that.
Yeah, I think the bar is set high with that Nations League Finals performance. Not only did they, win, but they were so enjoyable to watch. And so any type of letdown from that, I think, is going to be, Berhalter's going to get some criticism if there's any type of, letdown, from that.
Yeah. Well, when I look at the roster, I see a guy like Brendan Aronson, and I'm still not quite sure about what kind of player he is for the U.S. He's only 22, but to me, he's one of these guys that sometimes you're like, wow, he sure is doing a lot. And then you're like, well, what exactly do they do? So I think it'd be interesting to see what he does. Weston McKennie's kind of a tough one too, because he seems to always have an impact some way. But then sometimes you're always wondering whether he makes things a little more difficult for the way the U.S. plays because he's sort of a little bit of everything, So that I guess, go back to your first question about what Berhalter's approach is going to be. Is he going to tweak any of that type of stuff? I think Weston McKennie should be a defensive midfielder and focus on that. I'm sort of thinking about the old days where you would have a attacking, midfielder, a playmaker, and then you'd have a guy who would, cover for him defensively. I think there's something to be said for that, and especially all of us who've been enjoying Messi. I love the statistics that the two players that walked on the field the most in the World Cup were Leo Messi and Mbappe, because they knew when to run. I think Cruyff said something like that: "Don't run a lot, but run smart." And I think we have a lot of players that, we still have players that are all about running, and I'd like to see us get away from that and be a little smarter about it, because that is the difference, right? Because at the highest level, everybody's good, athletic, everybody's fast. You're not going to win because you outrun the other team anymore.
Yeah, speaking of Weston McKennie, there's a couple of starting lineup decisions I'm really curious to see what Gregg Berhalter does with. And one of those is the midfield. Tyler Adams is still out. We've seen, again, how Gregg's assistants have kind of managed that. And I'm real curious how Gregg's going to set up that midfield without Tyler Adams. What's your thoughts on, maybe how we should set it up or how you expect him to set it up?
Yeah, that you just kind of said, but the question, what I was trying to say with my last answer is, it brings up the McKennie issue, right? Because can you tell him to play in a disciplined, and it's a word I'm not going to throw around with soccer, but can he handle the midfield role like a Tyler Adams, which really did add a lot of stability to the U.S. team? Because if not, I'm not sure. Tanner Tessman, who I haven't seen play much in Italy for Venezia, but read about, saw a little bit. I believe he is a defensive midfielder type player, central mid. So I don't know what the possibilities of him being used. Of course, he's a late add-on because Johnny Cardosa got hurt, but it wouldn't be the first time that someone who got called in late, gets to play.
So you would like to see Weston McKennie in that kind of lone number 6 role, and then
I'd like to see them play without him first.
Yeah,
but it's you know what I mean. It's like you're watching. Sometimes you're watching him. Your guy, but then he'll set up a couple goals, and then you say, well,
he has a big personality on the field. You always kind of notice him out there doing things, but sometimes you do kind of wonder.
I remember when I was real worried about him being too much of a pit bull and getting yellows, and he seemed to kind of rein that in somewhat. Does Della Torre and McKennie, can they play together in as far as if they're the same kind of approach? I think that might be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I personally think McKennie and Musa are going to be out there. I'm not sure exactly how Gregg's going to set them up, but I would imagine they're going to be out there for sure. And then De La Torre is by far the most experienced of the other midfielders. So I won't be surprised if he's out there. I just don't know how Gregg's gonna, mix them all together. And I'm real curious to see that, or maybe he does give one of these younger, more experienced guys a shot.
Well, the other player, I should ask you. What do you think about Cade Cowell?
I'm excited to see Cade Cowell there. Because I think his upside. He has so much upside that I think if he continues to develop, in 3 years' time when the World Cup gets here, he's one of these young guys I can actually see making the team and having an impact. He's not ready right now, and he's still, he's still a little, rough around the edges in some spots, but he's a player when he gets on the field and I see him get the ball, I sit up a little straighter in my seat. You know what I mean? And so I'm really excited to see him out there with that, A team and see how he molds together with them.
Yeah, and it was probably a good idea to call him up because, I think he's struggling at Earthquakes right now, and he had some bad games in the Gold Cup. I know what you mean about him looking like he could always do something. I wonder sometimes if this, because in the beginning I always thought, oh, here's a big fast guy who's pretty skillful. And then all of a sudden he does something and you go, whoa, what happened to the skill part of it? But there were flashes of it, so it might still be there. And again, you're 19. And it's remarkable that players that young are getting playing time, and because MLS, you've got a lot of experienced players, and it is 19 years old, and this is what, his third or fourth season.
Yeah. Let me ask you about another position I'm curious about is center back. I'm curious what center back pairing Gregg views as his number one. I think Tim Ream's going to be out there because he had just such a good World Cup performance. He's still playing regularly in the Premier League. But I'm curious who Gregg's going to put next to him. Is it Chris Richards? Is it Miles Robinson? I think it's going to be one of those two. What's your thoughts on?
I think Chris Richards I think Chris Richards is the best. Last season he didn't, even when he was healthy, he didn't get much playing time at Crystal Palace, but he came in and he played very well. And Miles Robinson, I would think you pair one of those two with Ream. I'm sure Ream will start in St. Louis, and I think he's and I think it's cool that they brought him in, and I don't think that you have to base it on whether we know or not how he'll be in 3 years from now at the World Cup. It's possible that he can continue, but I've always kind of like Tim. I think he's a smart player. The thing to watch is, does he start getting a little sloppier as he gets older? I think he did get carded recently, where in the past relatively rare that he fouled and stuff. And also, no Walker Zimmerman, because he actually played pretty well after I thought he had sort of plateaued, but I don't know. I go back and forth with him. Like, I remember when he was first, I thought, he's not a super interesting central defender, but I thought had a little more to him than traditionally. He could hit a pretty decent mid-range, even long-range ball. But part of me also kind of wants to move on from him.
Yeah, he's one of those players where you think, okay, at his age, where he is now in his career, he's probably going to get phased out a little bit because we have so many young center backs in the system now. But he keeps getting called in. He keeps, putting in pretty decent performances. So I don't know, it's a matter of somebody beating him out, and I think that's going to happen. I think Chris Richards, the performance he put in the Nations League finals was so good. That's who I would expect, Gregg to start alongside Tim Ream. But we also know that Gregg thought really highly of Miles Robinson. In World Cup qualifying, Miles Robinson was going to be a starting center back before he got injured. And so I'm just curious what the pecking order is now, in Gregg's mind. And we'll get maybe our first glimpse of that on Saturday.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a different dynamic now. The U.S. men's team isn't together very often, so it makes it a little bit easier. It's not like the women's team that's together all the time. And when a coach tries to limit the playing time of the veterans, it's a big upheaval. But that doesn't mean Berhalter's not going to have to navigate playing time and how he's going forward with players and not face certain challenges, right? Like the guys who had his back. Hopefully he will not keep guys around who shouldn't be around the way that you see on the women's side. That really hurt the program, I think. And again, he's lucky that they're young. It's not like he's, except for, Tim and Walker Zimmerman, you're still talking about pretty young players.
Well, let's talk about the opponents, Uzbekistan and Oman. What do you know about them as opponents?
Not much. What the federation said and what the coaches are saying about they could be World Cup opponents is true, because the expansion, I believe it's 8 teams, and they're ranked like 9th and 10th in Asia.
So they're right there on the edge.
So it's in the realm of possibility they could qualify for the first time ever in their histories. Without being an expert on either, I would expect them to be kind of a defensive counterattacking teams. And the test then for the U.S. is can you get through that? They made such a big deal about playing different types of teams, which I suppose has makes sense. It could be they both are super defensive teams, and if the U.S. doesn't crack it, we could be in for pretty boring situation. But when you look at guys like Tim Wade, Pulisic, and Flo, they should be That's a pretty good, that's some pretty good talent up there.
Speaking of Uzbekistan and Oman, I didn't know much about them either, and so I'll just share a little bit of research
Thank you.
I came up with before we get on here. But they're both part of the Asian Football Confederation. Neither country has ever made a World Cup. When you look at Uzbekistan, when I look at their roster, the majority of their players play their club football in Uzbekistan, in the professional league in Uzbekistan. Yeah. There's a few in Turkey, Russia, a few in the Saudi league. They only have one player who plays in the top 5 league in Europe. I'm not going to say his name right, but it's Eldor Shomurodov. He plays for Cagliari in Syria. He's a forward. In 2022 World Cup qualification, they did not even make it to the final round of qualifying. They got knocked out in the second round. And I looked at some of their 2023 results against opponents we might be familiar with. They lost to Iran 0-1 in June in the final of this Central Asian Federation Nations Cup. So that's an opponent we know really well. So they played them close. They beat Oman in June 3-0. And then they had a couple friendlies in March against Venezuela and Bolivia. They tied Venezuela 1-1. They lost to Bolivia 0-1. So that's kind of like the bottom 2 teams in South America.
Yeah, I bet you they'll be packing in. I mean, even like a lot of the Middle East teams like Iran with, the teams that Carlos Queiroz coached, was it Egypt before Iran? Super defensive, frustratingly defensive, similar to some of the North African teams. So even if they're not, even if they look like a team that's going to be hard to beat, it could be frustrating teams.
Yeah. Some of those teams were one of those teams where you need to get that first goal, and then it makes things a little bit easier, but maybe that first goal is tough. Oman looks like they might have a little bit more quality than Uzbekistan. When I look at their roster, all their players do play their club football in Oman. But in 2022 World Cup qualification in Asia, they made it a little bit further. They did make it to the third round of qualifying. They finished 1 point behind Australia in their group, and Australia went on to qualify for the World Cup and make it to the knockout round. So they were only, 1 point behind them. Some of their recent results, they beat Saudi Arabia, World Cup team 2-1 in January in the Arabian Gulf Cup. And then going back to 2022 in November, they played a friendly against Germany and only lost 0-1. So I think Oman might be a little tougher competition than Uzbekistan, but these are both teams that I'd like to see the U.S. kind of, especially on home soil, kind of take care of business against. But we'll see.
Absolutely, no, they should be able to come out and have fun, have a good game with them. Yeah, you do. That's one thing I do like about being in soccer. You learn a lot about the world thanks to the fact it's such an international sport.
That is true. Well, Mike, any final thoughts you want to share about these upcoming friendlies before I let you go?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I really want to enjoy those games, so I'm hoping that they, play attacking, fun soccer, and I'd like to see what we saw in the Nations League, where once in a while you thought, or quite often you thought, this is good soccer. This is, and then we got a little bit of a wake up call in the Gold Cup, where, all of a sudden when certain core players aren't there, the drop off was a little more disconcerting than I maybe expected. So that's still out there, right? Like, how good are these guys really? Because for however much we celebrate these young guys going abroad, if you look at the last year, so many of them weren't getting playing time or getting off and on playing time. And, it's not like they're right there where we would want them. So it's kind of interesting to see them go into this season with their clubs and then with their first national team friendly games.
Mike, for people who want to see more of your work or learn more about you, is there anywhere you'd like to send them?
Absolutely. SoccerAmerica.com. You can get a free article if you just give us our email address. And I'm on Twitter. What do you call it? X.
Twitter/X, yeah.
at Mike Moitala. Every once in a while I tweet something. So, but SoccerAmerica.com, where we are in our 52nd year, starting off as a weekly magazine in the Bay Area and still going.
That's awesome. Well, I'll make sure and link to socceramerica.com in the show notes, as well as your Twitter. And Mike, thanks again for joining the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for listening to Here and Abroad. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a fellow USMNT fan. I'm Frank Garza, and I'll be back next week with a new episode.